Welcome back to the How to Japanese podcast. This is episode 4 of the Haruki Murakami season, and it's finally time. Today, I'm doing a power ranking of all 14 of Murakami's novels. My goal today is really just to kind of have fun and think about Murakami's novels as if they were football teams or something like that. But also, I think we'll hopefully get a sense of where Murakami is in his career and how successful he's been as a novelist. I'll be talking about the Japanese books themselves, not the translations, although I'm sure the translations will probably come up at times. I reread all of the books recently, except for the most recent 3, because they still feel pretty fresh in my mind somewhat. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't have the time or the heart to get through them again because they're quite chunky. I also didn't get through Kafka on the Shore for similar reasons, although I did page through that a little bit more than the others. And I didn't go through Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World because I know that book so well already. If you haven't seen on my website, I did a close blog of that book for 6 years and looked very closely at the book itself against the translation. I'll be referring to the books by their English titles because that'll just be faster and I won't have to switch between languages as much. Also, a heads up that there will probably be spoilers as I talk through these books. I won't be giving a detailed summary of each of the books, but I think in the course of discussing them, I'll be talking about different plot details. So if there's a certain book that you're looking to go into without any information whatsoever, I'd probably just avoid this whole podcast, to be honest. But that said, I think there would still be a perfectly good reason to read any of these, even after listening to this podcast. One thing I realized in the course of kind of preparing this podcast is I think that one of the core dynamics in Murakami's fiction is immediacy versus controlled narration, or what I'm calling controlled narration. I don't know if that's the correct term here, but I think it often takes the form of retrospective narration or some other kind of form that really focuses the narrative. A narrator that's in control of the action, creating a text for the reader, building meaning through a judicious selection of details. Whereas immediacy recreates an experience and puts the reader in the mind of that character, which happens in a lot of Murakami novels. Obviously, it's not completely black or white, but I think that looking at this dynamic is a really powerful way to examine Murakami's works and often reveals why certain works are stronger than others and others are maybe weaker. I think you see this immediacy effect in a lot of genre literature. The Hunger Games comes to mind. In that book, the reader really is there in the driver's seat with Katniss. The reason why I think it's weak is that it's the stuff of first drafts. You can output it without much consideration for the work as a whole. You're just kind of going with the flow with the character. You're not really thinking about some preconceived purpose for the text. The writer has to add that in post as they edit. If that's something they choose to do. A controlled narration, retrospection, is more difficult to land on the first draft, I think, unless you're really planning out a story. You have to rework it and get it in there afterwards, unless you're just a kind of a genius storyteller, which, who knows, maybe Murakami is in some places. I think the other problem that immediacy creates for writers is that it's very easy to lose control over the passage of time in a book. Because the only way to create forward momentum in the book is to have the narrator do something. The reader is constantly with the narrator while they're doing something, or in the case of Murakami, waiting for something to happen. This limits the action to a smaller window of time, I think, which restricts what the book can do. This is also true of a lot of genre fiction. A memory called Empire comes to mind. It takes place over the course of just a few days, when I think it would be much more successful if the reader was allowed to kind of exist in that world for a longer period of time. Not necessarily a longer page count, but just a longer period of time. This obviously isn't true of all genre fiction. One that's very successful that comes to mind is The Fifth Season, which I think doesn't rely on immediacy quite so much and is really in control over the passage of time. The immediacy can also create reader exhaustion. You just get sick of the narrative. Murakami's fiction, I think, suffers from these problems at times, but I think I'll be able to show where he's got some interesting solutions to these as well. Okay, let's get into it. Here are the novels in chronological order as Murakami wrote them. Hear the Wind Sing, 1979. Pinball 1973-1980, A Wild Sheep Chase 1982, Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World 1985, Norwegian Wood 1987, Dance 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 1988, South of the Border, West of the Sun 1992, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which has a super interesting provenance. It was the first part of it was serialized between October 1992 and August 1993. Parts 1 and 2 were then published in hardcover edition in April 1994 with some heavy edits, I would say, made to parts 1. And then in 1995, in August, Murakami added part 3 in hardcover. Sputnik Sweetheart in 1999, Kafka on the Shore in 2002, After Dark in 2004, 1Q84 in 2009, and then a third volume in 2010. Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage in 2013, and Killing Commendatore in 2017. Okay, I'm starting at the bottom. I've divided these into different tiers of books inspired by, I think, Bill Simmons and his power rankings for the NFL. So the first tier is the bottom tier, and it includes, in chronological order, Dance Dance Dance, Kafka on the Shore, 1Q84, and Killing Commendatore. So I'll start with number 14 at the very bottom, 1Q84. Yeah, unfortunately, something has to start at the bottom. Something has to be the worst Murakami novel. And I think this one is it. This was supposedly Murakami's comprehensive novel. That's the word he used. I think it's sougoteki in Japanese. And basically his definition of that was a novel has to be long, has lots of characters, and lots of different things happen, which seems like a pretty bland way to define a comprehensive novel. I really thought about trying to read through it again. I just didn't have it in me. It's that not good. I still haven't read the English translation in full. The biggest defect, I think, is the lack of control of the passage of time. It's ultimately telling the story of just a 9-month period, which comes up in Murakami over and over again. Killing Commendatore is the same way, and actually, I think Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is as well. But you get immediacy in both sections of the story, both in Aomame and in Tengo's section. And really the only relief between that is switching back and forth between their different points of view. And I think the best view of that is that the first chapter just doesn't really set up anything. You follow Aomame in this taxi, and she gets out and she starts climbing down a set of stairs, and that's it. That's all you get in the first chapter. Whereas in something like Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which I'll mention later, the entire novel is set up in the first chapter. You have the entire conflict and a lot of subtlety, which is ultimately, I think, why Murakami chose to expand that short story, is because it was so rich with so much detail and so much implied through such little amount of narration. And that just doesn't happen in 1Q84, unfortunately. Jay Rubin has, I think, one of the best quotes about Murakami's novels from his analysis of Kafka on the Shore, which is, and this is the quote, one's reception of Kafka on the Shore then depends heavily on the degree of one's willingness to go with the flow of the story. To a reader less willing, Murakami seems to be relying far too heavily on contrivance and coincidence, and he too easily overlooks inconsistencies in the realistic pain. And nothing characterizes this better than what I call Murakami logic. And in 1Q84, one of the best examples of that is this kind of dead set belief that Aomame has that she can't approach anyone in this world about what's happening to her. She, like a lot of Murakami narrators, is just forced to be completely on her own, which just seems kind of like a basic flaw in logic that you kind of have to get past in order to enjoy it. I mean, I have so many questions about this book. Why do we end up spending so much time with Ushikawa, who's such a miserable character? Why does Murakami trap such an interesting character like Aomame, who has this unique ability to assassinate people? Why does he trap her in a hotel room? Where does that decision come from? Why is he trapping her in a hotel room, having her read Proust? When you could be doing something far more interesting with a character like that. And then who are the little people and what do they have to do with anything? It seems like a tendency Murakami has to just kind of be very suggestive with things, and put things out there that are kind of weird or a little off or coincidental to kind of have provide something for the reader to wrestle with. The tone also felt really off to me. The novel was really kind of centered around the jazz standard Paper Moon, which Murakami mentioned heavily in the PR leading up to the publication, which is a fine song and kind of generates that, Far Side of the Moon idea of an alternate reality that I think he was drawing from. But the song itself just doesn't kind of vibe, I think, with the latent evil that he's writing about in this world, and is also a bit kind of, I don't know, maybe saccharine as a love story, as a song for a love story. And then, my final thoughts, I think, is that Fukaeri, the kind of young girl that is writing a novel that Tengo ends up ghostwriting, isn't really fleshed out as a character in the way that young women are in other Murakami novels, like Kasahara Mei in Wind Up Bird Chronicle and Yuki in Dance Dance Dance, which I'll get to those. I think one thing with these books at the bottom of the list is that there's an interesting kind of obsession with young women that seems to connect these novels, and even some of Murakami's good novels that exist as well. And it gets a little bit uncomfortable, I think, with the narrator's gaze at some of these characters. So we'll have to explore that moving forward. At 13, I have Killing Commendatore. This is another 9-month novel with very little control over the passage of time, which is a bit surprising given how strong the introduction is. It starts off with this great prologue about a faceless man coming to have his portrait painted, and a really strong first chapter in terms of the control of time, retrospective, the narrator setting up a 9-month period for him to kind of lose it, I would say, a little bit, as there's a character in Colorless Tsukuru Tozaki that says, everyone has a time in their life when they just kind of have to lose it and go a little bit crazy. And so he sets that up, I think, really strongly in the first chapter. But then he goes on to just isolate the narrator, this unnamed artist, in a house in Odawara, and then all these kind of weird things keep happening. The narrator ends up doing random research in a library, which is another habit that Murakami has. Murakami also dumps long sections of Austrian history into the novel. He ends volume 1 with a long quote from Samuel Willenberg, a survivor of the Treblinka extermination camp. And that's it. It's like a 2 or 3 paragraph quote. And that's all of chapter 32. And that's how he ends the book. There's no hint at what the narration is. It's just a bizarre choice, to be honest. There's another hole in the ground that he's obsessed with. The well in the Wind Up Bird Chronicle is such a strong image and so well used. Whereas here, it's just bizarre how fixated he is on this hole. I think he goes to the hole 12 times in the novel, goes back and forth, sometimes just to kind of look at it. It's not very exciting literature. The Murakami logic in this novel is that there's lots of secret keeping, I think, between the characters, the narrator, and Minsky, this kind of IT baron who lives in a house across the way and is spying on this young girl that could be his daughter, maybe. I didn't bother rereading this one, and I guess really the only reason I have it higher than 1Q84 is that it was slightly more interesting, and maybe that the narrative frame, this retrospective frame, is a little bit more well executed, I think. I really thought there was a lot of promise in it. This idea that of the faceless man as a metaphor of an artist suffering from writer's block, an artist being unable to paint someone's portrait, given metaphor by this trying to paint the portrait of a faceless man. That's kind of the expectations he builds for the novel, which I don't think he delivers. Again, there's an obsession with young women. This time it's 13-year-old Marie, and her flat chest. She's obsessed with her own flat chest. She's also not very developed, not only physically but also as a character. There's a lot that's suggestive without much content. When he finally gets the adventure going later in the novel, it's well towards the end, and he goes into this alternate dimension, and these characters from the paintings that he's been looking at finally kind of come to life. But it's too little too late. It's not very interesting. And then he reconciles with his wife without much explanation, to be honest. It would have been much more successful, I think, if he had some scenes between the narrator and the wife. I don't know if there's even a dialogue between the two in the novel, to be honest. This one was pretty disappointing. At number 12, I have Kafka on the Shore. I debated whether to put this or Dance 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 next, but after reviewing a few chapters of Kafka on the Shore, it's clear that Dance 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 has, I think, more redeeming qualities, or is at least entertainingly narrated, I would say. I didn't review this book. I just kind of ran out of time, and it's been a while since I read it. Murakami's doing some interesting things in terms of immediacy versus controlled narration. He starts off with these sections from military reports about an incident that happened to a group of kids during World War II, and that's set alongside chapters with Kafka, Tamara Kafka. But Kafka, to me, just kind of falls into Murakami's tendency to put his characters in these repetitive situations. He gets up every day, he exercises, he goes to the library, he reads, he eats lunch, he researches, and does this over and over again until something weird happens. And yeah, I don't know. And when something weird happens, it's not really clear what the meaning is, I think. Obviously, there are ways to interpret these, I think. But I don't think there's as much of a point, I think, as some of his other great books, even something like Dance, 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 which I'll talk about next. And we might as well get to it because I think that's all I have to say about Kafka on the Shore, to be honest. I know a lot of people really like it, but my thoughts would be that a lot of people like it because of that immediacy, because it has that same effect of putting the reader into Kafka's experience and having them see and feel these weird things, see and feel his isolation of this 15-year-old boy who, again, we're supposed to believe runs off and is reading 1001 Nights at a library in Takamatsu, Japan. I don't know about that. So, yeah. At number 11, I have Dance, Dance, Dance. This felt like Murakami's bubble novel, almost like an early midlife crisis novel. The character literally gets a Maserati. He's critiquing capitalism in this book, I think, but the narrator is going to Dunkin' Donuts every day for breakfast. The description of literary capitalism in particular seems pretty arrogant and privileged. He describes it as cultural snow shoveling and really kind of thumbs his nose at the publishing industry. It really feels like it comes too easy for the narrator and maybe reflects, I don't know, maybe Murakami's own personal circumstances with his writing. He really was incredibly fortunate to win the prize for his first book and then just plug immediately into the literary scene, and he's writing columns and he's serializing fiction immediately and publishing translations. I guess it's fun to kind of live in that mindset or read through the eyes of this cynical narrator looking at publishing and just kind of like churning out the equivalent of blog posts. But I don't know. So it feels like the opposite to me of The Wild Sheep Chase. It's not judicious at all with the details of the story. There's zero control over the passage of time in this book, and there's no relief from it like you have with his other novels. There's no switch to another point of view. There's no sections of meta-textual items like letters or things like that he would start using later in his career. There are 2 chapters where the character is literally stuck in an interrogation room. And at other times, the whole whole weeks will go by in a single sentence. The book is split into 2 volumes in a seemingly random place. It might have been stronger, I think, if he had set it up for the character to kind of go to Hawaii at the halfway point of the novel, because that would create a little bit more tension moving between the two volumes of the book. There are literally times in this book where the narrator says, "I just have to wait," and you kind of wait along with him. That said, there are some, I think, really strong aspects to this book. The most interesting part to me on this reread actually was the relationship between the Boku narrator and Yuki, the young girl who he ends up flying with from a hotel in Sapporo back to Tokyo because her mother is this kind of aloof artist and has run off and forgotten her daughter at this hotel. But there's really so much extra. Like he could tell the story of this young woman and her family and how he gets connected with them and what that says about art and modern Japan without all this excess stuff that he included with the Gotanda character, this actor who he, I think, went to high school with or junior high with. But it wouldn't be a Murakami novel, I guess, if that was the case. He builds this kind of coincidence that this young woman, Yuki, helps him realize that Gotanda killed Kiki, the girl from A Wild Cheap Chase that he's chasing after. But he's still exploring, like, I think his central theme from early in his career, which is surrogacy, which is attempting to replace the past with something else. This time he's trying to replace Kiki, but realizes he needs to kind of grab hold of the present and engage with Yumiyoshi, this woman from the hotel in Sapporo that he's fallen in love with. But to be honest, like, with that relationship, I think charmed me initially when I first read it in English translation when I was really young. But it just felt too easy this time. Like, it wasn't an earned relationship. It's a long distance relationship for most of the book, and they have really just a few phone calls, and it's nowhere even close to the level of the relationships that are being built and destroyed in Norwegian Wood. So it just doesn't get there for me. Interesting fact about this book is that Murakami wrote it in 4 months. There's an afterword in this book, and he explicitly says that it's connected to his other books. Basically, he says it's connected to the other 3 books that he's written with these characters, the Sheepman and Kiki and the narrator. And he wrote it from December 17th, 1987 to March 24th, 1988. So kind of incredible to put something like that together in 4 months, I guess. But ultimately, I think it's at the top of the bottom tier. Is, in a sense, it's maybe most characteristic of Murakami early in his career, I think, to be honest, or many Murakami techniques early in his career. But I think ultimately not a very successful novel. Moving on to the mediocre middle tier. This tier includes South of the Border, West of the Sun, Sputnik Sweetheart, After Dark, Colorless, Tazaki Tsukuru. Those are the books in chronological order. And at number 10, I have After Dark. This is a book that I really enjoyed the first time I read it. On reread, it dropped several paces in my rankings, to be honest. I really had it a lot higher. And then when I reread it, it just felt like it didn't kind of have a soul. It was a little bit cold. And part of that is, I think, intentional. The point of view that Murakami creates in this novel is very weird and different from what he normally uses. It's cold and analytical. You don't know who the narrator is, and you're observing this character sleeping in bed. You're looking at the city as a kind of organism and then zooming in on specific characters in this kind of robotic way. It's new, it's different, it's experimental. And I think it really should be considered Murakami's first third-person novel in a lot of senses, to be honest. Usually people can say that about 1Q84. I think Murakami does a lot here in this book with setting up an individual versus a larger system. Here it's a city and human systems more broadly, like the legal system. The legal system gets compared to a giant octopus kind of extending its tendrils into human activity. He also does his normal thing, isolating characters. In this case, Asai Eri is just sleeping in a room for long sections of the book. And those sections are very weird for Murakami. Nothing happens. She's just sitting there. She gets sucked into a room across the TV. There's a guy looking at her. I think it does provide some relief from the other narration in the novel, but there's not a problem with immediacy in the other chapters. So I don't think it functions in the way that switching points of view or using other types of text does in other Murakami novels. Murakami said that he wrote this novel like a script. He wrote the dialogue first. So he's trying out new techniques, clearly. It has an interesting result, I think. I always read it as an allegory for Japan and China's experience in World War II. You have this Chinese prostitute who gets beaten by a Japanese client when he discovers that she's on her period, and the book is kind of deals with resolving that and the effects of that violence on the other characters in the book, which I thought was interesting. You know, it's looking at maybe thinking about generational violence, how the impact of how violence on one person might have on others indirectly without them even realizing it. So ultimately, it I think is interesting, but not there fully for me. Thinking about it as a script makes a lot of sense. At times it feels like kind of these disparate conversations that Murakami linked together without too much context. Each individual one is maybe interesting, but together it just doesn't kind of pull together. And again, as with Dance, 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 I think the central romantic relationship between Takahashi and Mari isn't earned as well as some of the others in his great novels. I think and that's maybe a product of the limited time period. The novel takes place over maybe like a 12-hour period. And while it doesn't have the same immediacy problems in terms of the immediacy of narration, that limited period of time makes the payoff of a potential romantic relationship when Mari comes back from studying in China feel maybe a little bit shallow. So After Dark isn't his greatest work, but maybe one that's a little bit underrated and isn't quite included in the conversation about Murakami all that often. At number 9, I have colorless Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage. This was kind of a tough choice. I wanted to put this one a little bit higher maybe, but I think that he just has better books that come before this after rereading them. It's not a bad book. I really think that especially after 1Q84, it's a return to form, to be honest. He said it was a short story that he started writing and just kept going on longer with, and it feels that way. It feels very controlled. He has goals with it. It has a setup, and it has a great first sentence. Tazaki Tsukuru spent a year thinking about death. That's all he could think about. It has a great setup and premise, I think, for the novel. That said, I think Tsukuru as a character is a bit frustrating. He's introverted. He's passive. At times, incredibly frustrating. For a reader. But I mean, as a flawed, wounded character, you can kind of understand where he's coming from. He found it hard to love before he lost his friends, and then probably even more so after the fact. So his actions, I think, are supposed to be frustrating, and I'm sure he wishes it was easier to put himself out there. So yeah, it's no surprise that he finds himself, finding pleasure and comfort in the ordinary, everyday things like watching the trains come and go at Shinjuku Station. There are scenes where he just kind of sits there watching them come and go, and it's this very definite thing. The narrative balance felt a little off. Murakami adds these flashbacks in at the end that I thought would have been helpful in the front half of the novel to really kind of flesh out the stakes for Tsukuru. We know that these are important friends, but Murakami doesn't really give us any flashbacks of them growing up until later in the novel, once he's already kind of in pursuit of these friends. I think putting that in the front half of the novel would be much more successful. So yeah, basically when we meet the 36-year-old versions of these friends, I want to feel the same way that Tsukuru does, and I don't when I read this novel. Haida is a character that I think about all the time when I read this book. Haida is I guess, the fifth Beatle or something of this book. All the characters in this book have colored names, Ao, Aka, Shiro, Kuro, I think, and Tsukuru is the only member of this friend group that doesn't have a color. And then later, after they've broken up with him, he meets this Haida-san, and Hai is gray. And he, I think, functions as a really interesting character, coming into his life and then disappearing, which seems to be what one of Murakami's core ideas, the idea that people come into your life and they leave, and you have to kind of be able to deal with that. But again, I think there's a little nugget of Murakami logic in this book, which is that this could have been cleared up if Tsukuru just said, "Hey, what the hell?" to another character at a couple different points and tried to clear something up. But overall, I would say there's really excellent control of time, of the passage of time, control over the narrative, weaving in and out of stories, which is something that Murakami loves to do, and I think it's done really effectively here. So yeah, really good book, I think. Just slightly under the next one, I would say, I think. And at times I might waffle and put the next book at 9 and Colorless Tsukurutsaki at 8. It's, I think, a tough choice for me. At 8, I have South of the Border, West of the Sun. I needed to reread this one, and I did. Because I read it when I was in college, I guess, and I was kind of nonplussed when I read it. I didn't know really how to take it, but rereading it now, it felt like a more specifically told version of his first two novels. You have a narrator who comes of age during the student movement and then graduates into the decades of growth and the bubble. It feels like another bubble novel after Dance, 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 even though I guess the bubble had technically already burst at this point. That's, I think, shown by the fact that stock trading is a point of marital discord between the narrator and his wife. Surrogacy is, again, a major theme here, as with a lot of early Murakami novels. The narrator has this perfect child's love that can never be replaced and spends his life trying to approximate it, and then only ultimately realizing that it never existed or wasn't what he thought it was in the first place. And eventually just has to kind of come to terms with everyday life. This is one of the first books where you see the narrator that seems comfortable settling. I think Dance, Dance, Dance is probably the first. And then you see that again here. There's a lot of boring Murakami process stuff, working out, designing a bar, walking around and drinking coffee. This book and Dance, 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 I think, where you also start to see a lot of brand items make appearances. I think in early Murakami, you had more cultural items, music, literature, whereas with this book, you have, I think, Mercedes-Benz and different clothing lines and things like that. There's some long passages about talent versus effort, which seems to be a theme that Murakami also writes about, I think, in terms of his writing, in terms of just putting in the time and the effort, and then that would come, that would bring the talent. The one element of Murakami logic in this book is he tracks down he sees a woman who looks like this childhood friend, and then chooses not to confront her and say, "Hey, are you actually this person?" When it would be totally normal, obviously a little bit embarrassing when you do that to somebody and say, "Hey, excuse me, you don't happen to be so-and-so." But that's such a normal thing to do. And a lot of the narrative tension at that moment seems to be the assumption that there's no way I could do that. That would just be a totally crazy thing to do. And so I think that weakens it a little bit. But yeah, overall, not a bad book, I thought, on reread. Maybe a little bit annoying in terms of the stock trading stuff and some of the businessy aspects, I think. But interesting to see a Murakami narrator navigating a marriage and dealing with kids, which is not something you see in a lot of his books. At number 7, I have Sputnik Sweetheart. I actually really enjoyed rereading this book. When I read it, I was kind of unaffected by it the first time. It's really different. It's very dense compared to his previous writing. I think now, having just reread The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, it strikes me as that might be the the transition point between the types of writing between South of the Border, West of the Sun, and the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, and then even further into Sputnik Sweetheart, you see denser paragraphs, less reliance on just dialogue, and more third person. You see Murakami not writing in third person, but using a first person narrator to tell someone else's story in a way that mimics third person, a third person effect. So in this case, the narrator K relating Sumire or Miu's stories or experiences. Again, there's a lot of themes that relate to surrogacy and the approximation of an experience, a love that can never be fulfilled, of two different worlds, being here or there, being in a different place of existence than other people. The Ferris wheel section, I thought, is just such a strong piece of writing that's extremely disturbing and maybe an apt metaphor for a post-traumatic stress experience, watching yourself being assaulted. As a reader, I thought he wrote past the ending in this book. I wondered if it could have ended with the narrator on the Acropolis being devastated, knowing that he'd lost Sumire and would never see her again. As it is, it felt really similar to Norwegian Wood, to be honest, and perhaps weakens the trick of Sumire disappearing. To have her come back in the form of a phone call in the final pages of the novel, and then not really say whether or not she's actually alive, I think cheapens that device as in the novel. Whereas in Norwegian Wood, even though we don't really know what happens with Midori, we know enough to know that things probably didn't work out. Whereas in this one, and also when he writes past the Acropolis scene, you also get that really annoying scene with the kid and the girlfriend and her kid who is in trouble at the school, and he has to go talk to the principal or something. And I don't know. I felt like the chapter right before that was so well written that you could have just ended it right there. You have a couple moments of Murakami logic in this book. Miu calling the narrator before she calls Sumire's family. I think even before she calls the police on the island where she's staying when Sumire disappears. That seems like a weird thing to do. I guess he explains it away by saying that Miu was kind of like very confused at the time. The other moment is the narrator stealing Sumire's floppy disks from the crime scene, I guess, from the hotel room where she was staying, and then not giving those floppy disks to anyone and just reading the journal entries. And maybe that's, I think, compelling literature, I guess, looking at it now. You've got this character who's stealing and not acting logically. Maybe that's what makes it interesting literature. But at the same time, if you were really concerned about your friend, you might give those to the police because they might help you find your friend. I don't know. The logic in this universe, though, is that no one can see this writing. That seems to be the paramount concern, not finding Sumire, unfortunately. I don't know. But yeah, I enjoyed this book. Just thought the ending could have been a little bit stronger. We're moving now into the next tier, which I'm calling ambitious and innovative. This tier includes 3 books. Those books are Hear the Wincing, Pinball 1973, and The Wind Up Bird Chronicle. Have I surprised anyone yet? So those are our next 3 books. So at number 6, I have Pinball 1973. This is a very different book from his first novel. Hear the Wincing was so short that they had to indent the margins to fill out the book to 200 pages, whereas Pinball has full pages for 200 pages and has much longer passages, sustained scenes. You've got the first of Murakami's trademark information dumps. There's a lot of information on Trotsky's reindeer and the history of pinball. In terms of immediacy versus controlled narration, you have the rat sections, which are at times they start to alternate between the Boku narrators chapters and then the rats chapters, which are narrated in third person. Interesting early attempt at third-person narration for Murakami, and surprisingly, the third-person narration sections are reliant on this immediacy. You're with the rat. You're kind of going through this extreme depression with him, and the boku sections, I think, give us a better sense of relief from that. You have a little bit more comedic relief. You have these twin characters that are fun to be around. You get some weird Murakami scenes. And then the rat scenes, to be honest, seem to me to create this sense of the word that Murakami uses is unzari. That, to me, was the word of this book. It's a word that expresses frustration. And I felt like you really get a sense of the characters' frustrations with the era and their personal circumstances. To give you an idea of when this word gets used, when the character is smoking a cigarette at a train station, just kind of killing time, it's unzari. When he's thinking about how the scenery is all the same, it's unzari. When he's doing a flashback to living in a dorm and having to answer the phone for everyone in the dorm because his room was closest to the phone, and there was a girl on the second floor who always got these phone calls, and having to answer that phone when he didn't want to, that was an unzari feeling. The rat is totally unzari when he can't decide what he wants to do. He can't move forward, is kind of fed up. He can't get into a relationship with this woman, or doesn't want to get into a relationship with the woman because of the implications it would have. And it gets used when the pinball repairman comes to Jay's bar and does this incredible pinball run, and everyone there is super impressed, or I should say everyone being the narrator and the rat are super impressed. But somebody says, oh, but he must get tired of pinball too, which is unzari. And then also I made a note that people's faces drinking coffee during the fall is unzari for some reason. So that to me was thematically the biggest part of this book. But again, these sections from the rat really feel like they go on forever, even though they're not all that long. But the relief from getting out of those scenes is tremendous. And I think that's partially due to the fact that Murakami has narrative control over the rest of the sections of the novel. The passage of time is done really well. The book has a solid ending. I really liked it reading it this time. And I always, for some reason, felt like the twins just kind of disappeared, like a lot of characters do without any warning. But they're not like the Kano sisters who kind of like flit in and out of existence for Toru Okada. Here, there's a send-off. It feels meaningful. It's very nice and actually kind of sweet. There's some great dialogue in this book. The twins provide a lot of that. A lot of that is the comic relief I mentioned. It's very funny. There's a lot of really super strong images that really stand out and sit with me on this rereading. For example, the narrator visiting a train station to look for a dog that this woman, Naoko, who committed suicide, always used to talk about. So he goes to the station to look for the dog, and kind of imagining this small town train station in Japan is a strong image. Also, there's a moment when the twins go out on the golf course and the narrator goes out looking for them, the golf course near where they live, and they go walking on it in the evenings. And there's an outdoor escalator on the golf course. And Murakami doesn't mention anything about it other than that there's this outdoor escalator that they're going and they're sitting by or sitting on, I can't remember. And it's just so bizarre as an image because I've never seen an outdoor escalator on a golf course. But it strikes me as maybe this image of excess, of potential excess. And he doesn't do too much with it. It's just kind of put there as a setting. And I thought it was incredibly effective. And then the other image that's obviously, I think, maybe most characteristic of this novel is the refrigerated warehouse full of pinball machines and how they kind of turn on all at one time and come to life. Great novel, great book. The rat sections really slow it down at times, I think. But I thought is a good book, worth a read for sure. Not top Murakami, not top level Murakami, I think, but a very good book. At number 5, I think this is gonna maybe get me some haters, or will it? The Wind Up Bird Chronicle. This is a book that I hadn't reread for a long time, since college, and fell a lot in my estimation after reading 1Q84, especially once the third volume of that book came out, because I was like, what the hell? This is not good. did he do the same thing with the Wind Up Bird Chronicle? Was that not good and I just didn't realize it? But I reread it and that's not the case. This is a great Murakami novel. I don't think it is up with his greatest novels, and I will tell you why. First, let's look at this novel. It's 3 books. It's written over a crazy 3-year period from 1992 to 1995. Book 1 serialized in Shincho in 10 different issues. And then Murakami does some rewrites to it. I think probably adds a couple chapters, and then publishes that alongside book 2 in 1994. What happens in these 2 books? In book one is essentially a really subtle description of this family of Toru Okada and his wife Kumiko Okada, and how their marriage essentially helped her escape this uncomfortable family situation. It's very patient. It's slow, a slow setup. There is some randomness that you get that's a little frustrating, with a lot of suggestiveness especially when the Kano sisters, Kano Malta, comes in and says you have to watch for the flow, and things like that. But it feels very in control. There's no reliance on the immediacy of the experience of the narrator to generate reader interest. And I think it sets up all this conflict between Toru and Kumiko all there right in the first chapter of, do I really know this person? How much do I know this person? Are we getting along? What am I not realizing about my behavior that's affecting my relationships? At the end of book 1, you also get Lieutenant Mamiya's story about being in the well, which is just solid. It's a great little section. And so Murakami clearly had a chance to get through book 1 twice. He's been able to edit and revise. Book 2 starts to move closer to Dance, Dance, Dance in narration style, where it's this kind of ongoing experience with being with the narrator, this passing of time, creating suggestive moments. This is the section where Toru is confronted by Wataya Noboru at a hotel with Kano Malta and told that Kumiko has another man that she's been seeing. There's 5 chapters at the bottom of the well, but to be honest, those are better than the interrogation room scenes in Dance Dance Dance, because the bulk of those chapters are expanding on this kind of family experience between Toru and Kumiko. These are the chapters where we learn that Katsuhara Mei killed her boyfriend. That is a really devastating moment in this book. And this is the section where, in the Japanese version at least, the Toru resolves to go to Crete with Kano Krita. And that section gets abridged from the English translation. He's eventually talked out of that by his uncle, and then he has this random encounter with the man with the guitar, who he ends up kind of getting in a fight with, and then ultimately realizes he needs to stay and wait. And so that's where the book was. It's very similar to 1Q84 in a lot of senses, I think in terms of the passage of time, but it's much better done. I thought book 2 gets a little bit looser with the immediacy, and then book 3 is just all over the place. It comes out a year later, but also Murakami publishes the Zoo Massacre chapter as a short story before the book gets published in hardcover edition. I think maybe a good bit before. But book 3 is the part where all the metatextual stuff comes in. It's where you get Akasaka nutmeg and cinnamon, and the narrator starts earning money by being this bizarre way for women to let off steam or something, because of this mark on his face that has grown from spending time in the well. Even just describing all this gets a little bit crazy, but he's including Kasahara Mei's letters, digital chats with Kumiko, third-person passages written by Cinnamon, which are the literal Wind Up Bird Chronicles, and then Nutmeg's recollections of her father, who was in the zoo in China during the war, and dealing with the soldiers and the animals there. I think it's almost a disservice to call this a single novel, to be honest. Like, I get that it all takes place in the same world and with the same characters, but I do wonder, like, what would it be like if these were three different novels, right? Like, how would we think about it then? Like, what would you say if the first three, like, Marvel movies or whatever, the first three Avengers movies were all stuck together into a 6-hour movie, and then people are asking why it's so long? Like, I think that, I don't know. Um, yeah, I do want. That's what I thought about a lot this time. That book 3 is so long, though. Too. That's the one thing, is that it really takes a lot of time to get through, and then the sections with Toru really rely on that sense of immediacy to drive reader interest, and it can get a little bit tiring being with him there. But he's addressing interesting themes. Generational violence, war, being affected indirectly by violence, like After Dark in many ways, and I think we can blame a lot of those sections on one particular Raymond Carver story, which is called The Errand, or maybe just Errand, which is a story about the death of Anton Chekhov, narrated in third person. It's almost historical fiction at times, and at the very end you get that point of view of this helper boy at the hotel where Chekhov dies. And Murakami thought it was really striking. I'm going to talk a little bit about it a little bit more in maybe not the next episode, but the episode after that. But I think Murakami reads it and translates it right before he starts writing The Wind Up Bird Chronicle, which is where he gets this idea maybe to write these really brilliant third-person sections about set in the war, sometimes narrating other people's experiences, but also having Lieutenant Mamiya narrate his experiences. Gives us also some relief from Toru's point of view, and creates this other story where he's addressing some really amazing themes. But again, yeah, it is very messy, which is why ultimately I have it at 5. I read David Karashima's book, Who We're Reading When We're Reading Murakami, and he quotes from Michiko Kakutani, who reviewed it at the time, and she says that it often seems so messy that its refusal of closure feels less like an artistic choice than simple laziness, a reluctance on the part of the author to run his manuscript through the typewriter or computer one last time. But as looking at how the novel was written, it was almost impossible. It's almost a different kind of storytelling. The first book gets 2 passes at least, the second book a single pass maybe, and then the third book just feels like it comes out of left field, to be honest. This book is a solid book. I think there's a lot going on here. He does feel in control, especially in book 1 of the narrative, and he's working with a lot of his main themes. One of the great Murakami books, maybe not the greatest. I wouldn't put it in my top 3. And as you'll see, I have Hear the Wind Sing in front of it. At number 4, I have Hear the Wind Sing. This book feels more and more like a Japanese work every time I read it. I think a lot of people always emphasize the pop culture elements, Western pop culture elements, but it tells the story of a move to Tokyo, of the people who get left behind in the countryside and disappear. It's set, obviously, in an unnamed town outside of a major port city. All signs point to the fact that this is probably Murakami's own hometown of Ashiya, outside of Kobe. We're dealing with loss, the death of a college girlfriend, the French major who hung herself before a school break and wasn't found for 2 weeks. She comes up a number of different times during the novel as one of the narrator's first couple girlfriends. There's great dialogue between the characters, specifically between the narrator and the rat, and then the narrator and the girl without a little finger. I think their relationship really is the most interesting part of this book. It is 2 characters looking for some sort of surrogacy. The narrator still seems to clearly be grieving over the loss of this girlfriend to a certain extent, even though he doesn't say it directly, which I would say probably a strength of the book. And then the girl with the little finger, who has just gotten an abortion from a guy after a guy who she thought it might work out with, but then doesn't want anything to do with her, and is almost embarrassed to be trying to find some kind of connection. And they have this kind of measured engagement. They don't end up, fulfilling it physically, but there's this emotional connection that I think is really subtle and nicely done. And the work, even though it is very short, it is very sporadic at times. Murakami takes his time to get set up in this novel. There's a long introductory section where he's talking about, basically it feels like giving himself an excuse to write, poorly, to be honest, but an excuse to write, to get going. But once you're in it, it does feel like it's a very contained story that I think is successful, maybe in a way that The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle isn't in a lot of ways, to be honest, which is why I would have it at number 4. I do think that it's a strong work. And now we move into the final tier, which I call Peak Murakami. And this is the 5-year period from 1982 to 1987, basically. A Wild Sheep Chase, Hardboiled Wonderland, and Norwegian Wood. And at number 3, I have Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World. That might surprise some of you if you know how much I love Hardboiled Wonderland. Hardboiled Wonderland is, I think, his most ambitious and interesting novel, to be honest, in a lot of ways. I think a lot of people would say that it's Wind-Up Bird Chronicle or 1Q84 or one of these longer works, but Hardboiled Wonderland, it's really well woven, and I think by far one of the most interesting novels he's written. And I might have kept it at the top had I not spent 6 years doing a close reading of it and gotten a really up close look at all of the issues it has as a book. It's really an incredible ride, but the first 100 pages or so in English translation, so maybe the first 200 or 300 pages in Japanese, are really a slow burn. It takes a long time for him to get wound up, and then the kind of adventure gets going. There are some long sections in the library about unicorns, information dumps that you have to get through that maybe aren't quite so interesting. You have some of the same flaws as in 1Q84. Aomame only kills once as an assassin, and the data agent in the Hardboiled Wonderland sections, he only handles one case of shuffling, so you don't get a good sense of his work. You're not really in that world for a long enough period of time in terms of calendar time to get a sense of what happens in that world, which again shows that Murakami is relying on immediacy of the experience to drive that section of the novel. But that said, he's really perfected that narrator by this point. After 3 novels, he really hits this amazing balance between cynicism and nihilism, and it's a really fun look at Tokyo in the 1980s, going out to these restaurants, wearing Paul Stewart clothes or whatever. He's not totally brand name dropping like he is later on, but you have a lot of fun in Tokyo with that narrator. And then you get relief from that in the End of the World section. This is a revision, as I mentioned on earlier podcast episodes, of a novella called, The Wall and Its Uncertain, The Town and Its Uncertain Wall, or as the new Murakami subtitle gives us, The City and Its Uncertain Walls. And so he's revised this section and spaced it out over the course of the novel so that we get relief from each of these points of view. And we're in the End of the World for a longer period of time. We're in it for whole seasons. And it feels very controlled and intentional, especially on second draft. And it's really pitch perfect. It's such a pleasure to be in that part of in that world. And I really do think of it as like a kind of condensed impressionistic version of Murakami's classic Boku narrator. It's all very simplified. You have this lone individual living in this world that is kind of ruled by this system. The narrator, this individual is very isolated. is kind of doing isolated work, but has this hope at connection with romantic interest. It's almost like what people say about Whistler paintings. They're very muted and flat, with blocks of colors, which always reminds me of Whistler's Mother. Has that kind of weird title. It's not called Whistler's Mother. It's called like an experiment in brown and gray #5 or something like that. I didn't get the ending at first, but over time I've come to realize it's the only satisfying ending. If the book narrator, the dream reader, leaves the town, I think it would really make the reader wonder what that means for the data agent. But if he stays, it's all implied. The data agent dies and Boku lives on in this kind of infinite recreation of this story that he's generated in his mind. So yeah, structurally, I think it's his most compelling novel. The translation is definitely one of the best, but it cuts a good bit of the fat, I think, to its benefit. And some of the flaws that were cut, maybe show that even Horrible Wonderland was just beyond Murakami's reach at the time. We know that J. Rubin is doing a new translation of this, and I will be really interesting to see how it's received in comparison with the Birnbaum and Elmer Luke translation. My best guess would be that his full version of Wind Up Bird Chronicle, which I think will be released to Indiana University in 2026, will improve the reviews of that book, and that maybe Harbor Wonderland would get dinged a little bit in comparison. Not because of, I'm sure Rubin's translation is going to be fine. I just think there are some sections of that book that were cut that I'll be very interested to see how they get received. Also, obviously, I'm very interested to see what he does here with the new novel. What does Murakami feel like he can do now as a writer that he couldn't then? Is he in control? Is he relying on immediacy? Or is he finding a way to be in control of the narration? Is he doing that without shifting over to the horrible wonderland of Tokyo in the 1980s? Or is he going to revive that data agent? Very interested to see how that comes out. And now we're down to the top two. And at number 2, I have Norwegian Wood. So Norwegian Wood, published in 1987, skyrockets Murakami to celebrity status in Japan based on the short story Hotaru. So we have a nugget again, like we do with the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, that creates a really quick setup. The conflict is set up within the first, 50 to 75 pages or so. There's a little bit of an introductory section tacked on to the Hotaru short story. And then you have the Hotaru short story, which sets up the conflict with Naoko and their kind of collective grieving of Kizuki, their friend who committed suicide, Naoko's boyfriend, and Watanabe's best friend. And then you have the long denouement, which it spends the next 500 pages just kind of with the characters talking it out. Living in Tokyo at the time. There's these long passages of dialogue, these long sustained scenes and long chapters. I think the novel is only, 10 or 11 chapters, maybe 12 chapters total in a long book. And, that may not sound like a lot, but for, 400, 500 Japanese pages with 10, 11 chapters, that's not very much. If you think Wind Up Bird Chronicle 1Q84, these are 40, 50, 60 chapter books. So they're much shorter chapters. And it reminds me a lot of the Before Sunrise trilogy of movies that I think it's Richard Linklater. And they have these long shots that linger with the characters. And I think Murakami does that a little bit with some of the dialogue in Norwegian Wood. It strikes me as a very, very much a Tokyo novel. It's got the opening in Germany, which maybe gives this sense that Murakami is providing a perspective on Japan in a way that he hasn't yet. He's writing this in Europe, and so maybe that gives him that perspective. We go to Ochanomizu, Waseda, the Otsuka area around Midori's family's store, the Shotengai there. There's the rooftop at Takashimaya department store on a rainy day. You get a brief section of cutting through Kyoto, and that really stuck out to me this time. Murakami also mentioned in an interview in 2009 that he wanted to one of the goals with the book was to have scenes of three people talking. It was a stylistic challenge. It also makes me think a lot of Raymond Carver's story, what we talk about when we talk about love. You have these characters kind of like banging against each other, writing each other letters, trying to communicate their ideas about the meaning of like love and sex and things like that. And then again, you have Murakami's main theme in his early works of surrogacy. Both Watanabe and Naoko are trying to kind of create this love of Kizuki, and Watanabe's really spends the whole novel trying to approximate that single moment of physical connection with Naoko on her birthday. And then you also have Midori trying to kind of nestle into Watanabe's life somehow, get him to pay attention to her, and never really being successful with that. Murakami wrote it from, he has an afterword in this novel too. It's this and Dance, Dance, Dance are, I think, the only two novels that have afterwards. 1Q84 has this funny little sentence at the end, now that I think about it. It says, the language in this book wasn't actually used in 1984, which felt like a very weird thing to put there, to be honest. But the afterword, the very brief afterword in Norwegian Wood says, this is dedicated to my friends. And it also says where he wrote it. He says he started in Mykonos, Greece on December 21st, 1986, and finished it in Rome on March 27th, 1987. So again, 4 months to write this incredible novel. I think it, in terms of immediacy versus controlled narrative, it's very controlled. You know, it's starting in retrospective. Murakami has this nucleus for this novel with the short story, and is able to create this meaningful introduction that establishes a retrospective view on what happened, even more so than the short story itself. The short story itself is great on its own, I think, but with the introduction, arriving at an airport in Germany and having Norwegian Wood play over the speakers as they're deplaning and just kind of devastating the narrator, we are being set up for everything to come in the novel. And then we get even beyond that having that first chapter set up all the conflict, and then having the characters trying to figure out from there is very effective. And then in terms of the passage of time, it does feel very controlled. There are these long sustained scenes which are very immediate, but then you do have some passages where the narrator is much more in control over what's going on in time, you know. And then there's one brief moment where the narrator remembers the sunset in the US somewhere, I think, while he's writing something. I think, can't remember exactly what assignment he was doing there, but and then he remembers Nagasawa's girlfriend, Hatsumi, who ends up killing herself too, and it reminds him of her. And yeah, just kind of a devastating look at the humans trying to connect during this crazy period of time during the student movement in Japan. And a solid book, really great book. I really came into this project thinking it was going to be number one, but upon rereading it, it just felt like the only reason I would put it 2 is that it does feel long at times, especially some of these conversations. They do run a little bit long, and I felt like, you know, Wild Sheep Chase was more under control, and I'll get into that in a second. But Norwegian Wood, I think, is probably Murakami's most important novel. I think he's a totally different writer without it, and I think his career is viewed totally differently. I think he's still publishing a lot, and he continues to write. I don't know if he makes it to the celebrity status that he does without this book in particular, but he's such a workhorse that I think he gets most of his nonfiction and translation work done even without it. I just wonder if he lives a different kind of life without it. And maybe that results in a different kind of fiction, which then, I don't know, success in a different kind of way. But yeah, Norwegian Wood, deserving of all the success it had. Fantastic book. And finally, we're at number 1, A Wild Sheep Chase. I think this is pretty easily the best Murakami novel. This is Murakami in 1982 at the peak of his powers. Total control over the narrative of the passage of time. The jump he makes from Pinball 1973 to A Wild Sheep Chase in just 2 years is incredible. Like you really should read those 2 books back to back. And it feels almost like a completely different writer. It starts off with this interesting tone with the somber funeral for a hippie who would sleep with everyone, who would sit in these coffee shops and wait for somebody to come pay her bill and then go home with them in 1960s Tokyo, and this kind of narrator remembering her and then going to the funeral, which isn't very well attended. And then it's that sad kind of almost a symbol of the death of the student movement and this time period, but also a critique of that time period. And then jumping to this cynical modern day 80s Japan, cynical narrator divorcing his wife. The dialogue is great. The girlfriend with the magical ears, it's borderline pastiche. But it's the first time he's done it. She's an ear model, a call girl, and a proofreader. So, very Murakami. I can see it. It almost sounds like a line from 1Q84, with Aomame or someone like that, having all these different aspects. But I think also the relationship with the partner at the translation office is really well done. You have these kind of 2 people who are just sick and tired of each other, and there's one last thing they have to do, and they can kind of put up with each other for at least that long. The pacing throughout the book is really good. It doesn't really bog down in research sections, but you still have some, like the sheep section is still pretty interesting. And then the story of the right-wing politician, they keep moving. The only time it gets a little bit slow is when the narrator kind of settles in at the cabin at the end of the novel, and you start to get some of this Murakami, like, oh, I just have to wait for something to happen, or for me to figure out what to do. And then the premise is kind of somewhat predictable, I guess, especially if you're a mystery novel reader or like hard-boiled detective novel reader, where the narrator is a dupe for the right-wing politician secretary who knew where the rat was all along. They just needed somebody to draw him out, so he's getting used by this person without like fully realizing it. The one weakness I think is that maybe Murakami logic kind of is on the way out to the cabin, to Rat's cabin, where he's going to find the rat and hopefully this sheep that they're looking for. The narrator is suddenly like, oh yeah, the rat and his family owned this cabin up in Hokkaido, and they used to go there when we were kids. And that seemed like maybe unnecessary, or maybe it was Murakami's attempt to explain why the rat was out there. And maybe it does expand a little bit on this idea of the rat's family that gets described in Hear the Wind Sing, and kind of ideas of class difference between the 2 characters. But it also felt like it cheapened the hunt that they spent so much time on, trying to put all the pieces together and eventually tracking down this place and going out to the town and everything. So I felt like if you cut that, it's a bit stronger. But I think overall it really wraps up the ideas from his first 2 novels. You've got this economic growth encroaching on nature in Japan. You have these small towns dying as people are drawn to bigger cities, and they're losing a piece of what give them their kind of core essence. So it's critical of limitless growth in that point, in that sense. And then you also have this kind of vague ennui hanging over all of it, which is the kind of shadow of World War II. This limitless ambition that led to that war in the first place, and then specifically in this book that brought the the right-wing politician kind of back to Japan with this sheep inside him and led him to power, I think, and kind of indirectly connecting that with sheep and how they got to Japan and how they were used during the war. At its core, it really has a lot of what we see in future Murakami novels. It's a culmination of this narrator that we've come to know over the course of 2, now 3 novels. There's an interest in Japanese history, a critique of the way things went down in the late 60s and how things have developed since then and what it's doing to Japan. And it's all delivered in a nice, contained, intentional package that's funny and has an adventure. And maybe he's using, elements of genre to do that and elements of magical realism, but I think it's still a very serious novel. And I'd put it up against any of his novels. I think it's the best one. And that's the end of my power rankings. Tell me what you think. What are yours? Obviously, this is a subjective exercise, but I would say this is the correct order. The only one that I feel even slightly bit waffly about is Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage. That one I feel like maybe I need to give it a reread. Maybe it's a little bit better than South of the Border, West of the Sun. I'm not 100% sure on that. But I feel pretty good about my top 5 especially. Top 6, top 7, I feel very confident about. And yeah, looking forward to seeing where to fit this new novel into this set. So yeah, if you've made it this far, thanks again for listening all the way through. Starting next week, I'll be looking at Murakami's complete bibliography, and we'll go through book by book, all his fiction, nonfiction, and translations, and see the progress and see how things developed over time and how things went in his publishing career. So talk to you then.